We are coming into the second section with the other grantee, Deng Liwen. Deng Liwen is a writer and a curator who is based in Amsterdam. She obtained her PhD from the University of Amsterdam. Her project has the title of Southerness as an Angle from Southern Artists Salon to Theatre 44. It is about the development of self-organized group from the Guangdong region. Please welcome Liwen.
Hi, everyone. So first of all, I'd like to thank AA for facilitating the research. And I also want to pay tribute to 𝗏𝗏𝘄𝗁, who's the early member of the Southern Artists Salon, who sadly passed away recently. So now I will start sharing my screen. So my background is more in cultural studies. So this research is not just an art historical research, but it's more a combination of archival research and cultural studies research. So Southerness, what is that? So it's a bit tricky to talk about this term because it's so loaded with, for example, the Global South, this decolonization movement and the theories related to that, and also the non-alliance movement in Southeast Asia and also in Africa. But I don't really want to go deep into that. Otherwise, that's another kind of research already. But my approach is a little bit conceptual. So my interpretation is actually based on my embodied experience and observation of this self-organized practices in southern China and my archival research of these practices. So this is not a concept that's bound with southern China, but through these practices that we can look into self-organizing practices and the efforts of not to be governed like that. So the concept of not to be governed like that is from Michel Foucault, which means that it's a form of resisting the power from above, not like totally against it or fight against it, but to find ways that can live and work in another way that prevent themselves to be governed in such a way that it's either in or against the regime, for example. So my focus is mainly on 4 groups. The first one is in the 80s, the Southern Artists Salon. And the second one in the 90s, the Big Tail Elephants. And the 2000s, Yangzhang Youth and World Bookstore in Yangjiang. And the fourth one is Theatre 44, which is a bit nomadic, but some of the members are based in Guangzhou. And they started in 2018, 17, 18, and they kind of continue to now. So my methods are mainly archival research in AA, especially materials for the future. And I also did semi-structured interviews and participating observations during my research visits in 2019. Yeah. So yeah, so I have some kind of conceptual constellation to structure my research, but this is actually distilled from the research rather than kind of like a pre-imposed or kind of pre-conceptualized ideas. But I kind of like use these 3 concepts to thread through all these practices and also reflect on them as well. So the first one is about fluidity. So the way I frame it is a little bit more abstract, I know. But this, if I contextualize it, it means like people in the collective can be a little bit more fluid. They come and go, or they kind of like associate with each other in a very fluid way rather than kind of hierarchical way. So the second one is connectivity. That means they also connect to each other in a way that it's not very rigid, but they will embrace changes and multiplicity. So when something happens, they actually try to connect rather than to distinct and kind of exclude. And the autonomy one means it's actually, it's not kind of trying to be autonomous by isolating themselves, but actually try to provide help to each other and try to support each other when the resources are scarce, especially in the 80s and 90s, for example. And also the autonomy is more like communal autonomy, which is in relation to the outside world as well. So let's go to the Southern Artists Salon. It's a very interdisciplinary salon in the sense that one of the important members actually wanted to include people from different backgrounds, for example, philosophy students, dancers, and there are photos in which even a policeman was sitting in the lawn of Sun Yat-sen University to have a discussion with them. So he said that if you ask when was the start of real resistance to monopolizing official art system, that was the start of deep interrogation of cultural issues. That was a new wave in the 95. But in 95, in the South, in Guangzhou, the movement took form in salon rather than collectives with manifestos. So Chen Xiaoxiong, one of the members, said, at that time, we didn't want to categorize and separate arts. We wanted to reintegrate them. So it's a bit different from the North, in which those painters were grouped together and then make a manifesto and did things together. So the topics range from like the relation between dance and visual arts, and even thinking through philosophy, what is art doing, etc. So it's quite interdisciplinary, and the members can vary from 12 to 50 and even more. And this is one of the photos together in the Southern Artists Salon. And that's the first experimental show of the salon, in which a dance performance, an interactive dance performance was staged. And that's quite different from the other part of China, in which they will actually put up exhibition with like paintings, etc. But there were some criticisms from the internal members, for example, collectivism. So Huang Xiaopeng actually remarked, I've always been quite skeptical of collectivism. We all made proposals for the first show, but since Wang Du had rather strong characters, in the end, only his proposal was realized. Although we produced this show, the dance performance didn't really have much to do with us as artists. After the show, I told Wang Du that we couldn't continue like this. People in the group should be able to manifest their own individualities instead of following the leader. So the way they organize themselves still had some kind of hierarchy. And I want to move to a 𝗵𝗲𝘴𝐿 working group. And the three members all came from the Artist Salon, and Xu Tan joined later. So actually, Lin Yini reflected that only till 𝗵𝗲𝘴𝐿 that he could get rid of restriction of collectivism from the salon. So they organized themselves in a decentralized manner and treasure their own individuality and freedom and autonomy in art creation. Although there's some kind of rumor saying that, well, if you are actually, a little bit senior, you could have a better spot when you organize an exhibition. So it's kind of like this chattering from the next generation artists who got these rumors from the artists in Big Tail Elephant. So maybe there's still kind of like power dynamic within the group, but in general, they organize in a less centralized manner. So Chen Xiaoxiong said that it's kind of funny. It pulls us towards union, but it doesn't have a core. So not like the Southern Artists Salon. So we could see from Southern Artists Salon, there's certain kind of collectivism, although it's rather fluid with like different members coming in and out. And then Big Tail Elephant was more decentralized. And then, so this was the show, the group show, and it's actually, we could see this kind of like pop culture and everyday life influences in their works in the 90s, because Guangzhou was pretty close to Hong Kong, and this influence from the modern life was actually more prominent than other parts of China, especially you see Leonard, etc. And Lin Yilin's performance, that was in Hong Kong, I think. And so they also have this kind of mutual help within themselves. So they also share common interest in urban life, urban daily life. And also they wanted to have their independent practices rather than kind of collectivize and make a piece of work together. So they could actually support each other in terms of intellectuality, and also supported each other emotionally and share resources, because there wasn't much infrastructural support for arts back then. And also, according to Hou Hanyu and Cai Yinqian, who curated the show for Big Tail Elephant in 2016, there's a non-binary way of thinking and working in their practices. So Big Tail Elephant strove for the autonomy and legitimacy of artists, artistic production, and develop self-consciousness mode or critique and resistance to the modernist binaries of West/China, central/local, public/private, and avant-garde/conservative. And now I want to move to the Yangjiang Youth and World Organization/Bookstore. That's in the 2000s. It's based in Yangjiang. So there are two generations Yangjiang Youth. The first one revolves around, for example, 𝗔𝗿𝗄𝗁, and they actually live in a kind of like quite carefree way, but also they help out each other, and also they actually relate to the art scene in a more confident way, in the sense that they wouldn't feel that they are absolutely the periphery, but actually they could actually laugh at the power centers instead. And they supported the younger generation of Yangjiang Youth. So the second generation actually founded a kind of commune with the support of Chen Ge, who's one of the members of the World Organization of the first generation Yangjiang Youth. That's called 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗵𝗔𝗂, Home of the Youth with a Cut. With a cut, it's actually those kind of smuggled CDs and cassettes with a cut. That's what they refer to. And this literature and arts enthusiasts formed a commune and led the life of mutual aid and mutual inspiration, which was an exploration of autonomy. And actually they got this idea from the first generation as well. So that was the World Organization. And one of the members of this Home of Youth with a Cut, Feng Junhua, said that the antithesis seemed to demonstrate that the possibility of culture and creation come from themselves. When they gather, they talked about Yangjiang, Guangdong, and Hong Kong, and laugh at the power centers, both the north within the country and the global north. And Mr. Chen Tong defined himself as a neo-localist. So Mr. Chen Tong famously said, your point is, I don't go west, I go south. So that's not the very oppositional approach, but actually it's kind of like tangentially we go somewhere else and then we find our own way of producing arts and culture rather than trying to fit in or trying to fight against the trend or this kind of power. And for Feng Junhua, the most important thing is about how to decentralize rather than, you know, how to define what is center, what is non-center. So he actually founded a cooperative called Deng, which also published zines, and that was actually based in Guangzhou. And he also lived with others in a kind of communal way in this cooperative. And for him, it's actually important to continue this practices of decentralization after the cooperative has been closed. So he's actually, Feng Junhua is actually one of the initiators of the project on practice. So on practice actually gave birth to 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, which was a big part of my research. So Feng Junhua invited artists, researchers, writers, curators, etc. to join the project and to delve into the possibilities of transdisciplinary co-practicing. So practicing together, how can we actually collaborate and inspire each other in the context of China with all the restrictions, etc. And actually, because of the invitation, exhibition invitation by Times Museum, on practice thought about what could they do to make it more an exhibition-like, like kind of a format that could be presented in the exhibition setting. Because before they would actually, for example, read this kind of dramatic poem by this poet and writer Wang Wei. And that's more like a literature events, or kind of, it took place in Bookstore and also in the what's the a kind of independent art space. So, and then they thought about maybe we could actually make it into a theater, but theater not in a very typical sense, because the members didn't really come from the theater background either. And so 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 actually is composed of members such as artists, curators, researchers, and musicians. So they relate to each other in a fluid way as well. So there's no set list of like members, and there's no leader neither. And the first edition was roaming in the city at night, and testing the control in the city. That took place in Guangdong in January 2017, and I was there doing my PhD research. So fortunately, I joined two of this kind of nocturnal roaming performances. So the appropriate different open spaces, such as this kind of central reservation of the 𝗏𝗏 highway as a backstage for rehearsal, and also this pedestrian way in front of the Peasant Movement Institutes in central Guangzhou. They actually projected images and this poetic drama on the shutter door in a store in the area. So they appropriated a lot of spaces as well. And also like they move along the creek, the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 guerrilla tactics used by big-tailed elephants back then, because they actually also, I remember one of the exhibitions, they actually used a kind of army truck and transported this sculptures installation around the city. So it's yeah, so we could see this kind of similarity in how the younger generation took inspiration from the older generation as well in the same region. So, and also Big Elephant installed their artworks in non-art spaces such as those, you know, the building that was under renovation, places like that. So, and also, I think Zhu Jianli mentioned the importance of the site, 现场, yin chang. So, it's the site that when art happens, when life also happens, it's not separated. So for them, it's important to think about how it relates to everyday life. So that's that's the first roaming. Let me see. Oh, yes. I was just trying to check the time. So we actually have devices that were designed just for this kind of like mobile roaming. We call it kind of nomadic machines, for example. And this was near the Passive Movement Institute. And we also had a small portable projector and also some bags that could transport, for example, cardboard pieces and loudspeakers and stuff like that. So we kind of hack into the urban spaces using guerrilla tactics. And we also have like different interactions with passerbys. So the second edition was also triggered by an invitation to an exhibition in Times Museum about Pan Yunliang. And some members thought about dealing with gender issues. So they actually hosted quite a lot of workshops about gender issues and reading tests together, and asked some activists to give workshop, etc., and also watch films together and analyze them together. So they collectively wrote and produced an interactive theater play that was staged in Main Contemporary Art Museum in Shanghai called French 666, 𝗟𝗲𝗄𝗲. It was actually kind of a restage of the Dadaist theater, but the plot was about a social practice artist who overworked and fell ill. So it's kind of a criticism towards the art system and how art workers were treated. When I asked about a working method of Theatre 44, so different members express similar things. For example, they will actually work with different people in small teams in a non-hierarchical manner, and they will take care of each other, and they try to inspire each other as well. So that's actually one of the methods, and sometimes they continue this collaboration afterwards. For example, the 𝗦𝗹ci𝘂𝘁𝗵𝗲𝗿, it's actually a sewing co-op with artists and theater practitioner. And it's quite interesting because they actually grouped together during this second edition of Theatre 44. And they found that it's very comfortable for them to work together and to explore gender issues around women together via sewing activities, etc. The sewing activity also open to the public. So actually everybody can join and then explore this issue together while sewing and making garments or making different things with sewing machines. But there's also an opportunity for them to reflect gender equality and autonomy within Theatre 44. For example, the female curators Zhang Hannu and Li Xiaotian actually mentioned the issues of smoking when they had meetings indoors. Sometimes the male members started to smoke without asking for consent from others, and they found it very natural to do so. And in this edition, this issue was finally raised and addressed, and some house rules were actually made, because why the male members felt so entitled to just do so. What's the kind of like unset power hierarchy within Theatre 44? So that was actually being discussed during this edition, although it wasn't that easy. And then after that, the male members would actually go to the balcony to smoke, fortunately. So that was actually the screenshot of the costume runway. So kind of gender bending as well, because you could see the 3 male members were wearing the dresses and having this runway show. No, 4, yeah, sorry. The 3rd edition was actually a rupture, because the old members who have been participating since on practice tried to withdraw because they wanted to make space for new members. But then Xin Wei, who's actually the coordinator of the 3rd edition. So basically, they don't have like curators or directors, but they have coordinators who doesn't really have power to order people to do this or that. But the coordinator is always in negotiation with the participants. If the participant doesn't want to do something, then the thing is undone. So, so for him, this anarchistic structure and decentralized manner make it very hard for me to organize. Theatre 44 is destructured, but destructuration has to rely on a framework so that the group can still function. For example, tacit understanding of each other. In Chinese, it's 默契，默契. But then this kind of tacit understanding has to be built through time and this kind of thick hanging out, which is quite challenging if you don't really have this experience of working with each other and hanging out for long enough time. And how can you actually build this kind of trust and working method together? So for the new members who didn't experience this before, they just kind of like couldn't really gather and couldn't really find the momentum to work together. So Theatre 44 also faced a problem of regeneration as a result. So I asked Zhang Hanlu, who's a key member of Theatre 44, what's the working method? And she said, have a meeting to discuss a framework. But then for another member, Xu Zhenhao, he said that there's a problem about procedural justice. So sometimes there were only 3 to 4 people who discussed the framework, and the rest only could think of what they wanted to do in the framework, within the framework. So for him, it's very problematic if you found a center first, and then you try to decentralize it. So what he expects is not something efficient, but something more just, which requires participants to spend more time to invent new ways to do things together. And another thing is the unproducible embodied experience. For example, working together, hanging out, spending a lot of time together, which actually can become a threshold for new participants. And those who have the embodied experience of on practice were the key participant in Theatre 44, and which create this kind of barricade as well. So it's kind of the paradoxical decentralized center, which put this kind of like new members into this rupture. And so Xin Wei, who got very frustrated in the 3rd edition, wanted to actually figure out how Theatre 44 worked. So he volunteered to become the coordinator again in the 4th edition, which was actually a proper theater play. I think it was in 2018, if my memory serves me right. So it's invited by the main contemporary art museum in a theater program curated by Zhao Chuan. So they actually discussed what they want to work on, and by then there was a suicide case that triggered the members, especially the female members, a lot, and they could relate to it a lot. That's a middle school girl who was harassed by her teacher at school, and who got into this PTSD, but her case wasn't treated properly, and then she committed suicide, and it was actually live streamed online, and it caused a lot of sensation and discussions about that. So the members try to interrelate to the case and try to perform it. So that was the theater play that actually makes some audiences cry, and that didn't happen before ever in Theatre 44's performances. So for director Deng Liwen, so for him, if the previous editions were manifestations of artists' interest and taste, the breakthrough of this edition was that I wanted to communicate with the audience. The reason why some audience cried was because of we wanted to have real conversation with you. So they kind of switched to a more kind of artist or kind of artistic expression centered way of doing Theatre 44 to a more audience centered way, more kind of like communication based. But it sounds a bit paradoxical as well, since Theatre 44 is non-hierarchical. So how come we can have a director? So for Deng Liwen, who's also art worker and also theater practitioner, he's well aware of that. So he said that it's quite scary. You couldn't mobilize people to do stuff because he didn't have the power. So my legitimacy was always in the confirmation and reconfirmation. I realized that we needed to have consensus. This was what you really wanted to do, and I was here to assist you. And also, they didn't really spend every day together to create this piece. So it's also difficult for him to kind of coordinate this kind of collective creation of a theater piece. So one night he just called every member and say, I think what is most important is not to use artistic means to render it, but whether you care about this matter or not. If not, it's meaningless to continue. You should say what you really want to say, and I can give some guidance on how to transform it to theater performance. So he's more like providing assistance rather than providing guidance and directions. And so I'm almost going to the conclusion of my whole research. So basically, to wrap up on Theatre 44, we could see that there are so first of all, they learn from the earlier generations to use this kind of guerrilla tactics to hack into urban spaces, and also, for example, using exhibition to do things. For example, they would do this kind of activist workshops within the framework of an exhibition. So it's kind of hacking and guerrilla tactics. Secondly, so basically this is autonomy, connectivity, fluidity, yes. So these are the autonomy aspects, and the fluidity, because there are always different members joining, and the constellation every time is different. So there's a fluidity aspect. And the connectivity is that how they actually collaborate with each other in a rather non-hierarchical structure. So that's actually what they have been exploring and struggling along since since there's a rupture there, because we can't if you always have to rely on this kind of tacit understanding of each other that is built on this kind of thick hanging out and also working together, then it's hard to continue if someone withdraw or leave. So so in terms of connectivity, they're still kind of like exploring how to do that. So to conclude, what is Southerness? I want to refer to 𝗏𝗏 and Yangjiang again. They call for new strategies of resistance in the current global and national hegemonies. And the South is not a localist claim or identity politics, but as a starting point of the journeys to relate, to sensitize, to recuperate, to learn, and to unlearn. So it's not about the location itself, but somehow kind of like angle to restart, to relate. And also, I want to mention one thing, because actually 𝗙𝗵𝘄𝗁 is also in contact with different collectives in, for example, Southeast Asia, like 𝗏𝗏, Qunkai, and independent spaces in Thailand, in Bangkok as well. So they're actually learning from each other, this kind of so-called South-South relations. And so I want to argue that the embodiment of Southerness are fluidity and changeability, self-organization, the pursuit of autonomy, interlocal connectivity on the ground, and the efforts of going beyond the hegemonies. So the hegemonies here, I didn't really talk about it that much, but I think what I mean is there's certain ways that arts or kind of artistic creation are expected to be presented, and then when they actually go beyond that, then it's already the effort of not to be governed as such. For example, you actually roam in the city at midnight, rather than kind of we have an art space and we stage this piece and that's that. But I don't want to fetishize this angle as the angle to understand or conceptualize self-organizing practices, because it's actually an interrelational concepts, or kind of a concept that is more like a proposition rather than kind of like you know, a set in stone concept. And I'm also aware of the risks of romanticization of self-organization, since all the practitioners have to make their livings within this capitalist system. So again, it's just a proposition to think about self-organizing practices rather than, the angle to think about that. So I think I will just end here. Thank you.
Liwen, thank you very much for the presentation. For the audience, I encourage everyone to feel free to type any question you have in the Q&A dialog box. Before that, I'd like to just ask you a few questions, Liwen. I think you have touched on a lot of interesting ideas through your presentation. So I'm going to try to provoke you to speak a little bit more about some of the things. The first thing is the global South. You begin and talk about, you use the term Southerness, and it is quite easy for us to associate with the idea of the global South. But I think there is a certain contradiction when we talk about the Chinese South and the global South, because when we talk about the global South, it's broadly referred to Latin America, Asia, Africa, Oceania, in opposition to maybe North America or Europe and so on. So one of the characteristics of the global South is perhaps the economic backwardness, or the more like a more marginalized situation of culture and politics. However, in the context of China, when I talk about the South, it's quite different. The South is often referred to the more economically developed, right? And then because of the communist revolution and also the cultural revolution and things like that, the South is also considered to be a preservation of the true culture of China, the Chineseness. Some people may say that. So the Southerners will say that, oh, we have kept more traditions, like through our dialect, through Cantonese, through folk cultures and things like this. So the Southerners of China, the Chinese Southerners, in a way, can be a bit more proud of themselves in terms of economical development and cultural heritage. Okay, so you are a Southerners, you're from Guangzhou. So can you give us a general descriptions of the precise situation of this South-North dilemma, precisely within the context of China?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to respond to the Global South question. I think that because of this so-called economic backwardness, they actually invent a lot of tactics and strategies to act. And that's what's so interesting for us to look at, because when you don't have this kind of economic political powers, how you can actually produce arts and also be resistant towards the system that's dominated by the global North. So I actually, in my paper, I refer a little bit to these theories about Southerness or the non-aligned movement, etc. And also how this kind of global South facilitates certain kind of liminality, which is a new model of social, economic, political interaction that relies on egalitarian principles. So that actually inspired me to think about Southerness within the Chinese context. Because if you think about nowadays, well, I think the discourse about the South as a kind of like cultural deserts in the 80s and 90s was very prominent. I remember Xu Tan said something like, yeah, we don't really have culture in the South, but I feel elated. I feel happy to walk on this desert. So I think in the 90s, there was still this kind of narrative of like, yeah, you South open to this kind of commercial capitalist lifestyle, and you can't really preserve culture, and you don't really have this deep-rooted Chinese culture, blah, blah, blah. So it's actually interesting that this kind of stigma of like cultural desert still lingers on even today. But also if you talk about Southerner and thinking about Cantonese language and why Cantonese language is more Asian than Mandarin, etc. But that's not really mentioned in the practices of these four groups that I've studied. So I think, but probably within the Yangjiang group, there's another form of neo-localism, as Chen Tong terms it, which means that they don't need to play along the rules that is set by the North, like Beijing, Shanghai, for example. But actually they could actually find their own paths. They have their own ways of making art and living together. And there was actually a market for that as well. And it's interesting that even the generation of mine, like Zhu Jianning, he would actually say that, oh, you know, when people say that, oh, I'm from Guangdong, Ho Sang Mang. So it's like very, very, very interesting, very fierce. So it's like still there's some kind of like imagination of what comes from the south of China. Because they always expect something that's a little bit off, a little bit weird, a little bit surprising from the south. So it's quite interesting to see this kind of dynamic still in play nowadays in China. But if we talk about a bigger context of, for example, how people organize themselves as collectives and groups, I see more similarity of them and those groups in Southeast Asia rather than those collectives, for example, in the 1985 New Wave movement. So in this sense, I also want to relate the Southern China to Southeast Asia a bit more, although they only started this in 2015, 2016, but I think there are more interaction going on now as well. Maybe a bit scattered, but I hope I answer your question.
Oh, yes, it also leads to my second question. As you have looked at 4 groups from Guangdong, which are Southern Artists Salon, the Pictet 11, the Yangzhang Youth Group, and Theater 44. And they were from the 80s, the 90s, and from recent times. I'm wondering if you have seen a changing self-consciousness of being an art group in relation to the South in this group. What I mean is, okay, when Southern Artists Salon was formed and was active during the mid-1980s, they already labeled themselves as a representative of the South, as they call themselves Southern Artists Salon, right? They emphasize it in the name of the group. In the 90s, like Yangjiang group used, like you said, a kind of neo-localism in their self-identity. They emphasize that they are working around their home. They are deeply rooted to a local culture. Theater 44, less so, but they also have, centered their activities in the city of Guangzhou. Okay, and throughout this history, I think one of the important events to mention is the work of Hou Hanyu in the late 1990s and also the early 2000s, when he created something like Canton Express and a few exhibitions that dedicated to art from Guangdong region. So it leads to the situation, like I mentioned earlier, that Cantonese art or Southern art have built on a certain impressions in people's mind. It has a certain label now. So it means a certain thing. So it's a brand. It can be even marketized. So the question is, when you look at these 4 groups, how would you describe the change on this self-consciousness about the identity?
Yeah, so the first group is very obvious in the sense that they call themselves Southern Artists Salon, and they didn't really want to make a manifesto and make group shows in such a way together as those northern groups did. And they thought that we didn't really want to follow the trend. And I think Wang Du made a very bold speech in the Zhuhai meeting about we were just not playing by the rules. And it seemed that for them in the South, we could actually explore something different. And also there's space to do that as well. So those kind of meetings lasted for a whole year until some intervention from the power. So Yeah, so this kind of geopolitical condition of the South allows certain things to happen, for example, Southern Artists Salon. And it's quite a conscious choice to do it in such a way in the Southern Artists Salon. And in the second group, the Big Tail Elephants, I think they were all inspired by this kind of urban daily life culture that is quite distinct in the time in Guangdong, because in other parts of China, the reform and opening up didn't really happen that quickly. And also we have a lot of influence from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, because of the geographic location as well. And also the people's flow, because there are people who have like relatives from Hong Kong. For example, 𝗏𝗏𝘄𝗁 has relatives from Hong Kong that would bring him something. And then Xu Tan loved the pop song from Hong Kong, for example. So all this influence actually play kind of like found their way into their practices as well. And although they never said that it's about the South, but it's actually contextualized and also feel their practices and also their way of thinking and living. That's why they all already explore different formats, for example, installation and videos in the 90s instead of just paintings and photography. And then when they moved to the Yangjiang group, I think that was actually, yeah, because 𝗏𝗏 play an important role in kind of framing the whole region. And this Canton Express and also the different exhibitions about art from Guangdong actually, I think I interviewed him and then he thought that it's actually a very interesting cultural economic phenomena, kind of exception urbanism that happened in that part of China, that is very rapid and things are changing very quickly, and also a lot of things are being mixed at the same time. So a lot of influence from different places, and that's part of his curatorial practices. And also yes, indeed, that's how he framed this artistic practice from the South, and it's kind of branded as such, and you know much better than I do, I think. And Yangjiang group was framed in such a way, but this kind of like very grounded in local culture and ways of living together is very interesting in the sense that that particular place gave birth to that kind of practices. Like they would actually have a series of photos of like boys harassing a girl together and using kind of fake guns, and then also Zheng Guogu make a series of photos of learning from a teacher, which was a kind of a beggar squatting on the streets, and then he has now he's making this huge garden, an unfinished project named after the video game, and this garden is called 𝗷𝗵𝗎, and it's very distinct in the sense that it really grow out from that place. And so I guess there's a kind of like consciousness that we don't have to go so far away to be recognized or kind of get inspiration, or but we can actually make art here, and then people will actually be amazed by what we make from here. So it's a different kind of consciousness. But also there's a way that they support each other and kind of like support the younger generation for them to find their own way to work together, to live together. So that's why there's a kind of shift from the second generation as well. So they center less on artistic practice itself or kind of creating artwork itself, but actually to explore how we can live in such a way that we support each other and also make things together in a more collaborative way, a communal way. So that's why this 𝗏𝗏𝘄𝗁𝗔𝗂, this home of youth with a cut, existed, and then these people moved to Guangzhou, and then they started this on-practice projects in 2015, 14, 15. So this kind of communal experience or living together still inspire them and make them think about how we can actually decentralize and how we can actually live in such a way as a cooperative, as a commune, and kind of so. And then so this kind of lived experience in the South actually inspire on practice and Theatre 44. And then Theatre 44 is actually joined by practitioners from different parts of China, not just from Guangdong area. And it's also nomadic. So they were invited to an exhibition in K11 in Shenyang as well. But then this kind of non-hierarchical way of working that was inspired by, you know, for example, Big Tail Elephant and Yangjiang group is still very the base of what they do in Theatre 44. So I think in the sense that, in this sense, they relate to the South not as a locale itself, but it's actually kind of working method and kind of ethics of how they work together. So yeah, so I think this kind of southernness is not just about Guangdong and South, but just like a more non-hierarchical way of relating and moving, working. Yeah.
My last two questions. The first one, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the background of the major members of Theatre 44. Just tell us a little bit about them, because you didn't have, I think you didn't have a chance to mention that in your presentation. That's one. And the second one is, can you give us a comparison between the use of theater by Southern Artists Salon in 1985 and by Theatre 44 in the entirety of the practice?
Yeah, so the members, well, every time it changes in Theatre 44, but the first one was mainly Zhu Jianlin artist, Feng Junhua, the independent publisher and writer, and also 𝗔𝗵𝗄𝗃 artist, also Guangzhou based, and Pan He, who's writer, who's based in Shenyang, and he used to run this nomad bookstore in Shenyang, and also 𝗵𝗃 writer, and Tongmo was also participating. She's an anthropologist and writer, and 𝗏𝗿 poet and writer. And actually, we focus on his piece about actually, what's his name again? This Baron, Matt Baron called. So it's about the geopolitics of Northeast Asia, and also the history of that part of Northeast Asia. So he's been in the first two rounds of Theatre 44. No, the first round, the first edition for sure. The second one, oh yeah, Zhang Hanlu, the curator and writer Zhang Hanlu is always there, at least in the first 3 editions. And the second round about Pan Yuliang is mainly by Zhang Hanlu, Li Xiaotian, and also theater practitioner Jing and 𝗏𝗡， this artist also participated, and Feng Junhua was also there, and 𝗏𝗏， female artist. I don't really want to stress on female, but it's actually important to mention this because this kind of gender experience also was featured in Pan Yuliang projects, and Guo Yun, a curator, also Guangzhou-based curator. And the 3rd edition, I don't know whether name dropping is important, but I just want to mention that the 3rd edition, I think Guo Yun and 𝗏𝗏 are there, and Ding Bo is a theater practitioner. He used to base in Shanghai, but then he moved to Guangzhou. And Xin Wei was the coordinator. and some others. So basically they are quite young as well, 20s, 30s. So so a comparison between that theater piece in Southern Artists Salon. So that piece was more like a choreographical work, a dance performance, designed and directed by Wang Du himself. And Theater 44, technically there's no director. Even there's a director in the last edition, he was more like assisting people to find the theatrical language to render the performance. So it's not kind of like one main idea being executed and imposed on the performance, but he's more like try to pull things together, try to assist. So there's no kind of like hierarchical direction in this sense. So Theater 44 is more, in this sense, very fluid, and also sometimes people, like the audience, would lose the plot and what's going on. Sometimes it's actually the case. And also, I think it's more like a experimental field for those practitioners to work together rather than kind of, at least for the first 3 editions, it's the case. The 4th one was like, we really wanted to communicate with the audience. So, but in general, Theater 44 is more like a framework in which people experiment with how to work together in a non-hierarchical manner. Yeah.
That's a very good way to conclude our conversation. Liwen, thank you very much for the presentation and also speaking with me.